The streets of Belfast did not look like the streets of Basra. One was cold, narrow, rain-polished, and watched from terraced houses. The other was hot, open, dusty, and threaded by canals, oil infrastructure, and militia networks. But to British soldiers who arrived in southern Iraq in 2003, the difference was not as complete as it first appeared. They had seen before what it meant to fight in a city where the enemy did not always wear a uniform, where a child on a corner might simply be watching the road, or might be warning an armed cell nearby. They had learned that the most dangerous weapon in such a place was not always the rifle or the bomb. Sometimes it was the crowd. Sometimes it was silence. Sometimes it was the moment when a patrol stopped noticing the small changes around it. For almost 4 decades, Operation Banner in Northern Ireland had forced the British Army to learn a different kind of war. It was not the open battlefield of tanks, artillery, and sweeping advances. It was a war of alleys, doorways, informants, roadblocks, hostile crowds, coded warnings, political pressure, and split-second restraint. Soldiers learned to read streets as carefully as maps. They learned that a successful patrol was not always the one that fired first, but the one that understood what was happening before the first shot was fired. So when British troops entered Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein, they brought with them a reputation. To many observers, especially compared with heavier American methods in the early occupation, the British seemed naturally suited to counterinsurgency. They patrolled in berets, talked to locals, moved with a lighter touch, and tried to rebuild police authority rather than dominate every street with overwhelming force. It looked, at first, like Belfast had prepared them for Basra. But that was only the beginning of the story, because the lessons of Northern Ireland did make British soldiers sharper, calmer, and more dangerous in close urban encounters. Yet Iraq was not simply Belfast under a hotter sun. It was larger, more fractured, more heavily armed, and far less politically controlled. And the real question is not whether British soldiers learned from Belfast. They did. The real question is how far those lessons could carry them once Basra began to change. The Belfast lesson began with patience. British soldiers in Northern Ireland discovered that an insurgency could not be understood from behind armor alone. A patrol that moved too fast learned little. A patrol that stopped, watched, listened, and returned to the same streets day after day began to notice patterns. Which doors closed when soldiers appeared? Which windows remained open? Which men disappeared before a disturbance? Which alley suddenly emptied before an attack? In conventional war, a soldier searched for enemy positions. In Belfast, he learned to search for changes in human behavior. That experience shaped a generation of British infantry. They learned vehicle checkpoints, cordon and search operations, arrest drills, riot control, intelligence-led patrolling, and the careful use of minimum force. They also learned that every tactical action had a political shadow. One careless shot, one unnecessary search, one humiliating encounter at a checkpoint could undo months of effort. This did not make British soldiers soft. It made them controlled. It taught them that restraint was not weakness when used correctly. Restraint could keep a patrol alive, keep informants talking, and deny an insurgent group the propaganda victory it wanted. By the time Britain deployed major forces to Iraq, many officers and senior non-commissioned officers had inherited that institutional memory. Even soldiers too young to have served during the hardest years of the Troubles were trained inside an army shaped by them. They understood the language of presence patrols, community engagement, intelligence preparation, and avoiding unnecessary escalation. These were not abstract theories. They were habits drilled into the force after years of operating among a population that was sometimes cooperative, sometimes hostile, and often afraid to be seen helping either side. In southern Iraq, this seemed immediately useful. Basra was not Baghdad. It was largely Shia, strategically important, and initially less violently opposed to British forces than some Sunni areas farther north. British commanders believed they could apply a lighter style. Fewer aggressive displays, more contact with local leaders, more emphasis on restoring police, services, and normal civic life. Soldiers who had learned from Belfast understood that the population was the center of gravity. The enemy was not only the gunmen. It was the network around him, the fear protecting him, and the political vacuum allowing him to grow. But the same lesson contained a danger. Experience can sharpen judgment, but it can also create confidence. And in Basra, the British Army was about to discover that a city can look manageable right up until the moment it stops being manageable. At first, the British approach in Basra appeared to confirm the old Northern Ireland reputation. Patrols moved through neighborhoods with an effort to look less like an occupying army and more like a stabilizing force. Soldiers dismounted from vehicles, spoke with shopkeepers, met local officials, and tried to build the kind of street-level familiarity that had mattered so much in Belfast. The method depended on presence, patience, and recognition. A soldier who walked the same market repeatedly could learn which faces belonged there and which did not. A commander who met tribal figures, religious leaders, and police officers could begin to understand where influence really sat. This was the operational inheritance of Belfast. Control the temperature of the street before the street controls you. In Northern Ireland, British units had learned that escalation could be a trap. If every stone thrower was treated like a gunman, the crowd became the enemy. If every house search was conducted without intelligence, the army created resentment faster than it found weapons. In Iraq, that lesson mattered. British soldiers often tried to avoid turning ordinary civilians into permanent enemies. They understood that a city could be physically occupied but politically lost. Yet Basra was already moving in a direction that Belfast had not fully prepared them for. After the fall of Saddam Hussein, the collapse of central authority created a vacuum far larger than anything British troops had faced in Northern Ireland. Police stations, courts, ministries, and local services were weak, damaged, or compromised. Criminal groups, political factions, religious parties, smugglers, and militias all competed for influence. The British were not simply confronting one underground organization with a recognizable political structure. They were facing a shifting web of armed power. That made every Belfast lesson useful, but incomplete. Intelligence-led patrols still mattered. Restraint still mattered. Local knowledge still mattered. But in Basra, the men planting roadside bombs might also have links inside the police. The militia commander might also be a political actor. The neighborhood elder might be negotiating with the British in the morning and protecting gunmen at night. The population was not only afraid of insurgents. It was also watching to see who would eventually rule the city. This was where British soldiers became more dangerous at the tactical level. They could read tension quickly. They understood hostile crowds. They knew the discipline required when a patrol was being tested. But at the strategic level, Basra was becoming something more complex than a counterinsurgency problem. It was becoming a struggle for power after the state had broken apart. The turning point came when Basra's violence stopped behaving like the street disorder British soldiers knew how to contain. In Belfast, a hostile crowd could be dangerous, but it usually formed within a political environment the British state still controlled. Courts functioned. Police intelligence existed. Borders, ports, and government authority remained in place. In Basra, the British Army was operating inside a state that had been dismantled, then only partially rebuilt. This changed the meaning of every patrol. A soldier could dominate a street for an hour, but if the local police were infiltrated, if a militia controlled the night, and if political factions controlled ministries, then tactical skill alone could not secure the city. This was where the Belfast inheritance became both valuable and exposed. British soldiers were often highly effective in immediate contact. They could identify a crowd turning hostile. They could sense when a road felt wrong. They knew that a sudden absence of traffic, closed shops, or watching men at junctions might signal an ambush or an improvised explosive device. Years of counterinsurgency training had taught them to treat the civilian environment as an intelligence picture. They did not simply move through Basra. They read it. But the enemy was also reading them. Militias studied British patrol routes, vehicle habits, reaction times, and rules of engagement. They understood that British restraint, once a strength, could also be exploited. A gunman could vanish into a crowd. A bomber could use the cover of ordinary traffic. A militia could provoke a response, then use civilian anger to weaken British legitimacy. The same kind of disciplined restraint that helped prevent unnecessary bloodshed also made soldiers operate under immense pressure, because every decision was judged politically as well as militarily. The British Army had learned in Northern Ireland that intelligence was the real weapon in urban counterinsurgency. In Iraq it still was. But intelligence in Basra was harder to control because authority was fragmented. The British could gather information from patrols, informants, police contacts, and local officials, yet each source carried risk. Some informants feared revenge. Some officials had militia loyalties. Some police units could not be trusted. The city was no longer just a place to secure. It was a contest between visible authority and hidden power. By 2004 and after, attacks against British forces increased, and the early confidence of the occupation began to narrow into a more dangerous mission. Belfast had taught British soldiers how to survive among people. Basra taught them what happened when the political ground beneath those people began to collapse. The more Basra hardened, the more British soldiers had to fall back on the deepest habits learned from Belfast. Suspicion without panic, aggression without loss of discipline, and the ability to operate inside uncertainty. A conventional soldier might look for a front line. In Basra, as in Northern Ireland, there often was none. The danger moved through the city in fragments. A weapons cache in one district, a militia checkpoint in another, a police station quietly loyal to a faction, a roadside bomb placed on a route that had been safe the day before. The enemy was not always trying to win a battle. Often, he was trying to make normal movement impossible. That is why British patrol craft mattered so much. The soldier on foot, watching hands, rooftops, traffic, balconies, and side streets, became more than a rifleman. He became a collector of tiny facts. A new pile of rubbish beside a road might be harmless, or it might hide an explosive device. A crowd gathering too quickly might be curiosity, or it might be cover for an attack. A man speaking into a phone might be calling home, or he might be reporting the patrol's position. These judgments were never perfect, but the Belfast generation had taught the British Army that survival in an urban insurgency often began before contact, not after it. There was also a psychological edge. British troops had learned in Northern Ireland that fear could not be allowed to show itself as anger. A nervous patrol could become provocative. A humiliated civilian could become a future enemy. A raid that found nothing could still damage the campaign if it was carried out carelessly. In Basra, this mattered during searches, vehicle stops, and tense meetings with local leaders. Soldiers had to appear calm even when they knew they were being watched by men who might attack them later. That kind of control was not natural. It was trained, inherited, and reinforced by years of hard counterinsurgency experience. But control did not remove vulnerability. As attacks grew more sophisticated, British movement became more restricted. Heavier vehicles protected soldiers from bombs, but they also reduced contact with the population. Larger bases improved force protection, but they also created distance from the very streets the army needed to understand. This was the cruel balance of Basra. The more dangerous the city became, the harder it was to use the very methods that Belfast had made famous. By then, the British soldier remained tactically dangerous, but the mission around him had narrowed. He could win the moment, survive the ambush, control the crowd, and read the street. Yet the larger struggle was slipping toward militias, politics, and Iraqi power brokers who understood that time itself could be used as a weapon. In the end, the Belfast lesson did not make British soldiers invincible in Iraq. It made them more alert, more restrained, and more skilled at the intimate dangers of urban counterinsurgency. They knew how to patrol without turning every street into a battlefield. They knew that intelligence often came from repetition, memory, and human contact. They knew that the man who smiled at a checkpoint might still be afraid, that the crowd could change in seconds, and that a city had to be understood before it could be controlled. But Iraq also showed the limits of experience. Northern Ireland had taught the British Army that there could be no purely military solution to a political conflict, and Basra proved that lesson again in harsher conditions. When the soft posture became harder to sustain, when militias grew stronger, and when the state itself could not reliably impose authority, British tactical skill could not solve the wider crisis alone. The army could raid, patrol, train, negotiate, and hold ground, but it could not rebuild political legitimacy by itself. That is what makes the Belfast to Basra story so important. It is not a simple tale of one war preparing soldiers perfectly for another. It is a more uncomfortable lesson. Experience can make soldiers deadlier in the moment, but it can also reveal how little battlefield skill matters when the campaign around them is politically fragile. British soldiers carried Belfast's hard-earned knowledge into Iraq, and in many encounters, it made them sharper than their enemies expected. Yet Basra proved that the deadliest soldier still needs a strategy strong enough to match the city he is fighting in. If you found this story valuable, subscribe for more military history, operational analysis, and forgotten lessons from modern war.